Imagine, if you will, a man in 1993.
A very interesting year to start a story.
Right. And this man, he's a former therapist. Specifically, he spent over 15 years working in the trenches of human psychology with abused and troubled teenagers.
Which is, well, it's incredibly heavy, demanding work.
Exactly. And now he's driving across the American South with his wife, and the trunk of his car is just packed to the brim with copies of a self-published book.
Just out there on the road.
Yeah. There's absolutely no marketing budget. There's no major publishing house backing him, no publicist booking him on morning talk shows.
No social media campaigns to leverage back then either.
None of it. There's just a trunk full of paper and this profound, unwavering belief that the people who were, quote, ready for the message would somehow find it.
Yes.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are immersing ourselves in one of the most astonishing publishing phenomena of the 20th century. I'm talking about James Redfield's The Celestine Prophecy.
It is such a privilege to join you for this.
And I am so thrilled to have you with us and you listening as we journey into the Peruvian rainforest of the mind.
Well, if we pause for a moment to consider that opening image you just painted.
The car trunk.
Yes. A man trusting that his book will find its way into the hands of the right people at precisely the right moment. If you think about it, we uncover a profound irony there.
How so?
That grassroots car trunk strategy wasn't just a desperate marketing ploy. It was actually a living, breathing manifestation of the book's very first conceptual pillar.
Oh, the synchronicity thing.
Precisely. Synchronicity. He was relying on the fundamental thesis of his own manuscript to distribute the manuscript.
That is wild.
He was, in effect, testing the universe to provide the distribution network.
He essentially willed it into the cultural zeitgeist using the exact metaphysical principles he was writing about.
He did indeed.
And just to give you, the listener, an idea of the sheer volume of material we are synthesizing today, our stack of sources is just massive.
We have quite a bit to cover.
Yeah, we've got academic evaluations dissecting the narrative architecture of the book. We have deep dive literary reviews, sharp theological and scientific critiques.
Which are quite polarizing, I might add.
Oh, incredibly polarizing. Plus, we've got expansive interviews with James Redfield himself and incredibly moving personal blogs from readers who swear this book just rewired their entire existence.
It really did change lives for a great many people.
So our mission for this deep dive is to completely decipher the Celestine Prophecy universe. We want to trace the book's central thesis, this grand historical transition from materialistic survival to a global spiritual awakening.
A shift that, he argues, is deeply necessary.
Right. And we are going to analyze how its core insights serve as a psychological and narrative scaffold for human evolution. Okay, let's unpack this. Where did this guy come from, and how did a therapist selling books out of a Honda Civic spark a global movement?
Well, to truly comprehend the scale of this phenomena, we must first look at the crucible that forged the author himself.
Let's do it.
James Redfield was raised in a rural area near Birmingham, Alabama. He was immersed in a loving, community-oriented Methodist environment.
So a very traditional upbringing.
Yes. Yet, as a young man, he found himself bumping up against the edges of traditional theology.
Like he wasn't getting the answers he wanted.
Exactly. He was frustrated by a lack of experiential answers to his deeper spiritual inquiries. The dogma wasn't quite enough, so he went on to study sociology at Auburn University.
Okay, shifting to a more academic view of people.
Right. And while there, he heavily immersed himself in Eastern philosophies, particularly the flow states of Taoism and the mindfulness of Zen.
So he's mixing Southern Methodism with sociology and Zen Buddhism. That's a unique cocktail.
It is. Following that, he earned a master's degree in counseling. But I would argue the most critical piece of this puzzle is those 15 years he spent working as a therapist with severely abused adolescents.
Yeah, that's a heavy background. I mean, you don't spend a decade and a half working with teenagers who have endured profound trauma without learning something fundamental about human nature.
You certainly do not.
Specifically about how, broken people interact with each other.
That is the crucial underlying context here. He wasn't simply theorizing in some ivory tower.
Right, he was in the mud.
Yes. He possessed the clinical, day-to-day understanding of interactive psychology. He saw firsthand how humans manipulate, how they defend themselves, and importantly, how they heal.
So he's got this clinical observation, plus the sociology of group dynamics, plus Eastern mysticism.
And he managed to synthesize all of these seemingly disparate fields, the gritty reality of psychological trauma, the interconnectedness of ecology, the transcendent claims of mysticism, and even, well, speculative elements of quantum physics.
It's a lot to smash together.
It is, but he put it into a highly digestible, accessible format. Essentially, he disguised a dense psychological treatise as an airplane thriller.
Right. He took all these incredibly dense, esoteric concepts and wrapped them in like an Indiana Jones-style adventure story.
A very astute comparison.
But the traditional publishing gatekeepers in New York, they didn't get it at all.
Not in the slightest.
They couldn't categorize it. Was it fiction? Was it a self-help manual? Was it a New Age manifesto? Because they couldn't put it in a neat little marketing box, they universally rejected it.
Which forced his hand, really.
Yeah, so Redfield does something incredibly bold. In 1989, he quits his stable job as a therapist to write full-time.
A terrifying leap of faith.
Definitely. By 1992, he takes his life savings and prints 3,000 copies of the book under his own imprint, which he called Satori Publishing.
Satori, of course, being the Zen Buddhist term for sudden awakening or instantaneous enlightenment.
A rather bold declaration of intent for a self-published venture, right?
It's very bold.
And the success story from there is just staggering. He and his wife, Sal, start out by mailing or personally handing out 1,500 copies to small metaphysical bookstores and individual seekers.
Just giving them away, hoping for a spark.
Exactly. And from those initial seeds, the book exploded entirely via word of mouth. Within 6 months, they had sold 100,000 copies.
An unheard of number for a self-published title out of a car trunk.
And that organic, undeniable momentum caught the eye of Warner Books, who swooped in with an acquisition deal somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million.
A life-changing moment.
Completely. And after that, the floodgates opened. It spent 165 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list.
It's almost hard to fathom that kind of sustained popularity.
It became the #1 international bestseller of 1996, eventually selling over 20 million copies globally, translated into dozens of languages.
But the magnitude of that success, cannot be attributed to the marketing alone, or even just a catchy story.
What do you mean?
To understand that kind of cultural saturation, we must examine the specific historical moment the book arrived in. Why did it explode in the early 1990s?
Right. What was going on in the culture?
The text itself attempts to answer this very question. This brings us to what the book calls the second insight, the longer now. It provides a sweeping historical framework.
So it zooms out.
It asks us to look back at the last millennium of human history. The book argues that for the first 500 years of that millennium, humanity's worldview was dominated by strict religious dogma.
The medieval era,
Oh,
basically.
yes. The church provided the meaning of life, the structural hierarchy of the universe, and absolute moral certainty.
But not much room for questions.
None. It severely stifled personal inquiry and intellectual freedom. Then, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, that monolithic worldview fractured.
Thank goodness for that.
Indeed. Humanity collectively shifted its focus. We turned our attention toward scientific materialism.
Meaning we focused on what we could touch and measure.
Exactly. We made a collective, unconscious decision to conquer the physical earth, to extract its resources to better our material situation, and to map the mechanical laws of nature.
It's like humanity spent 500 years building a really comfortable high-tech house, but forgot to figure out why we actually want to live in it.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Like, we got the indoor plumbing working, we set up the electrical grid, we stocked the fridge with exotic foods, and we eradicated a bunch of diseases.
All wonderful achievements.
For sure. But at the end of the 20th century, we're just sitting on our expensive couches, feeling completely empty.
We must linger on that analogy because it strikes at the very heart of the sociological condition Redfield diagnosed.
The emptiness.
Yes. We achieved unprecedented secular economic security in the West. But in the relentless process of building that comfortable house, the underlying question of meaning, the spiritual purpose of our existence, was relegated to the margins.
We were too busy building the house to ask why we were building it.
Exactly. By the late 20th century, this relentless pursuit of material comfort had left humanity grappling with a profound sense of anomie.
Anomie. Can you break that down for us?
Certainly. Anomie is a sociological term introduced by Emil Durkheim. It describes a condition of instability resulting from a breakdown of standards, values, or ideals.
So a loss of direction.
Yes. A restless, pervasive spiritual void. The culture of the early 90s was collectively exhausted by the hollow promises of materialism, yet deeply disillusioned by the rigid structures of traditional religion.
They were caught in the middle.
Precisely. People were primed. They were waiting in the dark for a new framework that could reconcile the scientific reality of the modern world with the spiritual yearning of the human heart.
And then out of the trunk of a car came a manuscript claiming to offer exactly that synthesis.
A perfectly timed arrival.
Which brings us to the actual structure of the book itself, the narrative scaffold. Let's step into the Peruvian rainforest.
The setting of the adventure.
Yeah. The author chose an adventure parable as his delivery mechanism. It's essentially the classic hero's journey framework.
Very much so.
You have a protagonist who is pulled out of his mundane, slightly depressing life, crosses a threshold into a dangerous unknown, meets various wise mentors.
Faces severe trials.
Exactly, and returns with a transformative gift for society. But what's really unique, and I know some critics absolutely hated this, is that the protagonist is completely unnamed.
Yes, he is.
He's an American former social worker, much like Redfield himself, but we never learn his name. He has almost no distinguishing personality traits.
While literary critics often point to that as a failure of character development, we must recognize it as a highly deliberate didactic mechanism.
So it wasn't just lazy writing.
Not at all. By keeping the protagonist a blank slate, the author removes the psychological barrier between the reader and the text.
I
He
see.
invites the reader, you, listening to us right now, to project yourself directly into the protagonist's shoes.
That makes total sense. So you become the one stepping off the airplane into the humid air of Lima.
Yes, you are the one hacking your way through the dense jungle canopy. You're the one experiencing this sequence of profound psychological awakenings.
It transforms a passive reading experience into an active psychological projection. And the setting is so vivid, you're thrust into the lush, mysterious Peruvian rainforest. You're exploring the ancient Celestine temple ruins and hiding out at the enigmatic Vicente Lodge high up in the mountains.
A very evocative landscape for a spiritual journey.
But it's not just a peaceful meditation retreat. There are massive, real-world stakes.
The danger is very real in the narrative.
Yeah. The Peruvian government, working in direct collusion with certain powerful factions of the Catholic Church, specifically embodied by a character named Cardinal Sebastian, are actively hunting down anyone who possesses the manuscript.
They view it as an extreme threat.
They are suppressing this ancient 600 BC Aramaic text with actual military force.
The presence of the military and the oppressive Cardinal Sebastian is vital. It adds a necessary layer of high adventure and mortal danger to what could otherwise devolve into a very dry, static, philosophical dialogue.
It keeps the pages turning.
It does. But fundamentally, Cardinal Sebastian represents the old paradigm of institutional control.
The dogma from the first 500 years.
Yes. He views the prophecy as an existential threat to established spiritual authority. He fears that if individuals learn to connect directly and experientially with the divine, they will no longer require the institution of the church as an intermediary.
Right. If you have a direct line, you don't need the operator.
Exactly. This ideological conflict is what drives the plot forward, forcing the narrator to stay on the run, learning these existential lessons sequentially out of sheer necessity for physical survival.
And the very first thing he has to learn, the catalyst that kicks off the entire journey before he even gets on the plane, is the first insight. The concept of meaningful coincidences.
The synchronicity we touched on earlier.
You know, when you're thinking about an old friend you haven't spoken to in 5 years and suddenly your phone rings and it's them.
Yes, that precise feeling.
Or you're struggling with a massive life decision and you stumble across a book left on a park bench that answers the exact question you've been agonizing over.
Carl Jung, the eminent Swiss psychiatrist, coined the term synchronicity to describe precisely those events.
Right, occurrences that are connected by meaning rather than strict cause and effect.
Exactly. The manuscript suggests that feeling that specific, nagging restlessness, that enemy we discussed earlier, is actually the first true symptom of spiritual awakening.
So feeling lost is actually the first step to being found.
A beautiful way to phrase it. It is the moment an individual begins to notice these synchronicities and realizes they carry a statistical weight that makes them too significant to dismiss as mere chance.
It's the dawning, slightly unsettling awareness that a mysterious, organizing force is operating underneath the surface of our daily lives, gently nudging our individual destinies.
If we cultivate a state of alertness, these chance encounters provide the initial breadcrumbs to our ultimate life purpose.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate here.
By all means.
If we are being guided by coincidence, what is the actual physical engine driving that guidance? Like, how does that actually work mechanically?
Now we arrive at the third insight.
Right, because the book tries to answer this at the Vicente Lodge, where the characters are conducting scientific experiments with plants,
Yes, they are.
and the narrator learns to physically perceive subtle energy. The sources describe it as a whitish glow or a wide blue field enveloping living things.
This is where the text makes its most controversial metaphysical claim.
I bet the physicists loved this part.
Well, it borrows heavily, and many physicists would argue, erroneously, from speculative interpretations of quantum physics.
Right.
The text posits that the universe is not constructed of dead, solid Newtonian matter. Rather, it suggests the foundational building block of reality is dynamic, invisible energy that is highly responsive to human intention and conscious expectation.
So at the Vicente Lodge, the characters observe that when researchers project focused, positive attention and genuine love toward a plant, the energy field around the plant physically expands.
Yes, and the plant's growth accelerates.
Conversely, when the plant is ignored or subjected to negative emotional projection, its energy depletes and it withers.
A direct physical reaction to emotional energy.
I know the scientific community pulls their hair out over this application of quantum mechanics, but the book claims that you can train yourself to see this.
It does.
It argues that before you can see this whitish glow, the mandatory first step is cultivating a heightened sensitivity to beauty.
You have to learn how to truly look.
Yeah, you have to look at a tree or a mountain and pause until it suddenly seems incredibly sharp in shape, vivid in color, almost glowing with an inner luminescence.
The book says when objects start looking hyper-real to you, that means you're beginning to perceive their underlying energy field.
You're tapping into the frequency.
Precisely.
But of course, if this invisible energy exists, and if it can be given or manipulated by intention, it can also be taken.
And this is the dark side of the equation, the fourth insight.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This is where the book shifts from esoteric mysticism into incredibly sharp human psychology. We have to talk about the struggle for power.
This specific concept is arguably the most universally recognizable and immediately applicable aspect of Redfield's entire thesis.
Energy theft.
Yes. The text explains that humanity has historically suffered from a profound, unconscious disconnection from the universal source of this energy.
So we're running on empty.
Exactly. Because we feel cut off from the divine infinite supply, we walk through life feeling chronically weak, insecure, and lacking in psychological sustenance.
So what do we do about it?
To compensate for this internal deficit, humanity has developed a highly destructive, unconscious habit of stealing energy from one another.
It's like an invisible vampire feeding frenzy, but instead of blood, it's psychological validation.
That is a rather vivid but entirely accurate summation.
Let's make this real for a second for the listeners. Think about an everyday office interaction. Have you ever walked away from a conversation with a coworker? Maybe they didn't even yell at you. Maybe they just subtly undermined your idea in a meeting, and you felt completely drained, exhausted, and physically smaller.
I think everyone has experienced that.
Meanwhile, that coworker walked away looking incredibly puffed up, energized, and vibrant.
Yes.
The book argues we unconsciously manipulate conversations, we argue, we intimidate, we play the victim, all to force the other person's attention and psychological energy to flow toward us.
We do it constantly without realizing it.
When we win the argument or when we successfully make someone feel sorry for us, we get an actual palpable energy rush. We feel strong. But it's entirely at the other person's expense.
We must go deeper into that office example because it perfectly illustrates the central tragedy Redfield is diagnosing.
The root of the problem.
He argues that this unconscious, relentless competition for human energy is the root cause of almost all human conflict.
All of it.
According to the text, yes. Every war fought over resources or ideology, every bitter domestic squabble in a kitchen, every toxic workplace dynamic, it all stems from this desperate, unacknowledged need to psychologically dominate others to steal their life force.
That is a staggering way to view human history.
We engage in this psychological warfare because, in our disconnected state, we genuinely believe that human energy is the only energy available in a universe of scarcity.
We think there's a limited pie, and we have to fight for a slice.
Exactly.
But the book offers an exit ramp. It says, wait, you don't have to live as a psychological vampire, constantly trying to one-up your spouse or your boss.
There's another way, the fifth insight.
There is a way to bypass human energy theft entirely.
Yes, the text introduces the concept of the mystical connection. It teaches that the universe itself contains an infinite, abundant, accessible supply of divine energy.
The ultimate limitless battery.
Precisely. We have the latent biological and spiritual capacity to connect directly to this source. When an individual successfully establishes this connection, they no longer need to manipulate their peers, their children, or their colleagues for energetic sustenance.
Because they're already full.
Yes. They can draw it directly from the environment around them. The book places a heavy emphasis on nature as the easiest conduit for this. Ancient untouched forests, old-growth trees, the deep appreciation of profound natural beauty, and the quiet stillness of meditation.
And the sources note that Redfield describes the physical sensations of this connection very vividly.
It's not just an intellectual exercise.
Right. When you manage to plug into the universal source, you don't just have a nice intellectual thought about God. You feel the distinct sense of buoyancy, a physical lightness in your limbs.
You feel physically altered.
You feel exhilaration and this constant underlying background emotion of pure, unconditional love. You're not just thinking about the concept of love. You are physically bathed in it as an altered state of being.
A profound state of grace.
But here's the massive catch. You can't just go sit in a forest, plug into the universe, and stay there if you have all these psychological leaks in your system.
No, the energy will simply drain right back out.
Exactly. Which brings us to the absolute core of the book's psychological framework. This is the sixth insight, the control dramas.
We must spend significant time here, as the exploration of control dramas, often referred to in the text as clearing the past, is undoubtedly the book's most practical, enduring, and rigorous psychological contribution.
It's basically intense therapy.
It is. Redfield leans heavily on the clinical framework of psychiatrist Eric Berne and his theory of transactional analysis.
Remind us what that is.
Transactional analysis examines the unconscious social games people play to achieve psychological payoffs. Redfield adapts this framework into his concept of control dramas.
Okay, so what exactly is a control drama?
They are manipulative, highly predictable, unconscious behavioral scripts that every single one of us learned in childhood.
Every single one of us.
Yes. Why? Because children are physically small, emotionally vulnerable, and utterly powerless.
That makes sense. They're totally dependent.
To survive, a child has to figure out a reliable strategy to compel attention and therefore life-sustaining energy from the powerful, often distracted adults around them.
So they figure out what gets mom or dad to look at them.
Exactly. The tragedy is that we carry these juvenile survival strategies directly into our adult relationships.
The book categorizes these childhood survival strategies into 4 main control dramas, functioning on a spectrum from highly aggressive to highly passive. Let's walk through them, and as we do, I want you listening to think about which one you default to when you feel threatened or insecure.
It requires a great deal of honesty to identify your own.
Okay, number 1, the intimidator. This is the most active, aggressive drama on the spectrum.
Yes, the blunt force approach.
The intimidator uses overt threats, unpredictable outbursts of anger, physical dominance, or intense emotional volatility to force people to pay attention to them.
They steal energy by creating a constant environment of fear.
Think of a boss who blows up over minor mistakes. Everyone around them is walking on eggshells, hyper-focused on the boss's mood, constantly funneling their own mental energy toward the intimidator just to keep them from exploding.
All of that anxiety is energy flowing directly to the intimidator.
Exactly. Okay, what's next?
Right below the intimidator, still on the active side of the spectrum, is a more insidious, intellectualized drama. The interrogator.
Oh, this one is rough.
The interrogator rarely uses overt, screaming anger. Instead, their weapon of choice is relentless, corrosive questioning, and hypercriticism.
Like they're always looking for a flaw.
Yes, they're constantly scanning their environment, and you, for flaws.
Mm-hmm.
They find the holes in your logic, the inconsistencies in your behavior, or the mistakes in your choices.
Imagine a parent who never praises a child's A grade, but immediately interrogates them about why it wasn't an A+.
A perfect example. By perpetually picking you apart, they make you feel fundamentally inadequate, defensive, and self-conscious.
And when you're defending yourself,
In that exact moment of defensive,ness, when you are frantically trying to justify your actions, you are handing your energetic power over to the interrogator, who sits back in a position of smug, cynical superiority.
wow. That one hits close to home for a lot of people. Okay, then we move to the passive side of the spectrum. The third drama is the aloof.
The strategy of withdrawal.
Right. This person's strategy is to pull away. They act mysterious, distant, and emotionally unreadable. When you ask them what's wrong, they say nothing, but their body language screams otherwise.
The silent treatment.
Yeah. They give vague, non-committal answers. They make you work incredibly hard just for basic communication.
And how does that steal energy?
Well, by acting like they don't care, or by disappearing into their own world, they force everyone around them to chase them, to dig for information, to try and pry them out of their shell.
Yeah.
And all that frantic chasing, all that worrying about what the aloof person is thinking, that is a massive stream of energy flowing directly to the aloof person.
Very subtle, but highly effective.
And then finally, we reach the most passive and arguably one of the most draining dramas of all. The poor me.
This is the embodiment of the classic victim complex.
The martyr.
Exactly.
Eh.
The poor me does not threaten you like the intimidator, nor do they withdraw like the aloof. Instead, they broadcast their suffering.
They make sure everyone knows how hard their life is.
Always.
Mhm.
They constantly highlight their bad luck, their physical ailments, their unfair treatment by the world, and their fundamental helplessness.
Do they use guilt?
They weaponize guilt and self-pity to manipulate others into feeling perpetually responsible for them.
And when you rush in to comfort them,
When you rush in to comfort, counsel, or financially save the poor me, you are effectively draining your own life force to prop up their narrative of victimization.
it's a brutal mirror to hold up to yourself. When the pressure is on, do you rage and intimidate? Do you criticize and interrogate? Do you shut down and act aloof? Or do you collapse and play the poor victim?
It is not an easy assessment to make.
And the book goes a step further. It demands that you look at your parents.
Yes.
Because Redfield argues that these dramas don't just happen in a vacuum, they breed each other in families, passing the trauma down generation after generation.
The mechanics of how these dramas generate one another is fascinating. According to Redfield's sociological observations, an interrogator parent who is constantly prying, criticizing, and demanding perfection will almost inevitably create an aloof child.
Because the child just wants to hide.
Yes, the child realizes that any information they share will be used against them in an interrogation. So the child withdraws to protect their energy, learning to hide their true feelings and operate in secrecy.
That makes total psychological sense. What about the other ones?
Conversely, a terrifying intimidator parent will often create a poor me child.
Because fighting back is too dangerous.
Exactly. The child learns that fighting back against an intimidator is physically or emotionally dangerous, so their only survival mechanism is to act completely helpless and compliant to evoke pity and stop the aggression.
Or, alternatively, the child might decide to fight fire with physical fire and become an intimidator themselves, perpetuating the cycle of aggression.
Okay, so if we are all locked in these vicious generational cycles of psychic vampirism, how on earth do we stop it?
That is the pivotal question.
The book says we have to engage in a deeply introspective process called clearing the past. You have to look at your parents, maybe for the first time, not as the mythic figures who raised you, but as wounded children themselves.
You have to see them as individuals stuck in their own controlled dramas that they learned from their parents.
You have to figure out what they were unconsciously trying to teach you and what they fundamentally failed to resolve in their own lives.
Yes, the psychological goal here is to reach what the text calls a higher synthesis of your upbringing. This requires a radical reframing of your personal history.
So changing how you view your entire childhood.
The book suggests that you must recognize that you were born to those specific parents with their specific flaws and control dramas for a distinct evolutionary reason.
Wait, really? Like you were meant to go through that?
That is the assertion. By dissecting and understanding the specific mechanisms of their control dramas, you can transcend them.
Okay.
You consciously extract and integrate the positive attributes they modeled. You actively heal the psychological wounds their dramas inflicted upon you. And you make a conscious, disciplined choice not to pass those manipulative patterns forward to your own children or peers.
So you break the chain.
Precisely. The text insists that only by fully clearing this past trauma can you permanently plug your energy leaks. And only when you stop stealing energy from others do you finally have enough internal reservoir to unlock your true spiritual mission in life.
Okay, let's assume you've done the grueling therapy. You've cleared your control dramas, you're consciously plugging into the universal energy found in a beautiful forest, and you're noticing those synchronicities.
A state of readiness.
Now what? You have all this energy, what do you do with it? That's where we move into Insight 7 and 8, the mechanics of engaging the flow.
Yes, entering the conscious flow of evolution.
The book argues that once you stop wasting massive amounts of mental processing power on manipulating the people around you, your mind suddenly opens up.
The seventh insight.
You start paying close attention to sudden urges, to the symbolism in your dreams, and even your seemingly random daydreams. Instead of dismissing them as neurological static, you treat them as intuitive guides.
The text encourages the cultivation of a state of alert expectation.
What does that look like in practice?
The methodology is quite specific.
Yeah.
You are instructed to formulate a fundamental life question. What is the next step in my career? How do I heal this relationship? What is my core mission?
Okay, you have your question.
And then you hold that question in your mind while observing the world. You watch for the intuitive nudges, the fleeting thoughts, and the external coincidences that provide the answers.
But the book says to maintain this flow, you have to change how you treat other people.
Ah, yes. The eighth insight. This is the province of the interpersonal ethic.
Right. If the earlier insights warned us against the dangers of energy theft, this insight instructs us on the mechanics of unconditional energy giving.
The opposite of the control drama.
Instead of draining the people you encounter, you actively, consciously project energy into them. You attempt to uplift them by focusing intently on the divine beauty and latent potential within their faces.
It sounds quite esoteric, I know.
It sounds a bit woo-woo, honestly. But think about the psychology. You literally look at a person, a stranger on the subway, or your annoying coworker, and you try to see the absolute best, most divine version of them.
You change your perception of them entirely.
And by doing that, by giving them your undivided positive attention, you send them a wave of psychological energy. They feel lighter, they feel smarter, and according to the book, because you have elevated their energy state, they are far more likely to intuitively speak the exact message or piece of information you need to hear for your own journey.
It creates this beautiful, positive feedback loop of shared energy.
It really does. But the book gives a massive, glaring warning right here, specifically regarding romantic relationships. It warns against the trap of romantic addiction.
We must pause on this concept, as it is a highly perceptive psychological observation wrapped in mystical terminology.
Break it down for us.
Redfield cautions that when two people initially fall in love, they are freely, unconditionally projecting massive amounts of energy toward one another.
The honeymoon phase.
Exactly. That mutual energy projection creates the intoxicating euphoria of the honeymoon phase. The world seems brighter, problems vanish, and they feel invincible.
Because they're just feeding each other so much energy.
However, if they make the critical error of merging their energy too quickly, demanding that the other person become their sole, exclusive source of spiritual and emotional fulfillment, they effectively cut themselves off from the infinite universal energy source.
Uh-oh, so they unplug from the universe and just plug into each other.
Yes. They become addicted to one another's human energy. And inevitably, because human energy is finite, that reservoir depletes.
And what happens when the tank hits zero?
When the energy runs dry, the old, unhealed control dramas return with a vengeance.
Oh, wow.
The intimidator starts yelling, the interrogator starts criticizing, and the relationship devolves into bitter, destructive ego battles over who controls the remaining energy dynamic.
It's a profoundly accurate way to look at why passionate romances so often crash and burn into toxic resentment. We demand the other person be our entire universe instead of standing side by side and connecting to the actual universe together.
A very tragic but common human feeling.
Okay, so if humanity can somehow master all of this, if we can clear our childhood dramas, follow our intuition, and uplift each other without falling into codependent romantic addiction, where does it all leave? What is the end game of human evolution?
The ninth insight.
And this is where the original book departs from psychological self-help and goes full-on, wild sci-fi utopian vision.
The culminating vision of the original text is indeed sweeping, bordering on the fantastical.
Paint the picture for us.
The book predicts that as a critical mass of humanity integrates these 9 insights, the entire structural foundation of human civilization will undergo a radical metamorphosis.
Over a long period of time, right?
Yes. It suggests that over the coming centuries, technological innovation will advance to the point where all mundane survival, labor agriculture, manufacturing, basic services will be completely automated.
So no one has to work a boring 9 to 5 just to survive.
Precisely. Humanity will no longer need to toil endlessly for basic physical necessities. Consequently, the human population will naturally and voluntarily stabilize and eventually decrease to a level the Earth can easily sustain.
And the cities.
Our sprawling concrete cities will shrink and decentralize, allowing ancient old-growth forests to reclaim vast tracts of the Earth, serving as massive protected vortexes of pure, accessible spiritual energy.
It envisions an entire global economy that isn't based on money, capitalism, or material goods, but a spiritual economy. People will freely give and receive information, insights, and energy. We will all essentially become spiritual teachers for one another.
A beautiful vision, certainly.
Ooh, hold on. We have to talk about the absolute wildest claim the book makes regarding the end game of our biological evolution.
The ascension.
Yeah. According to Redfield, as we do this, we will continue to raise our internal energy vibration level higher and higher, and eventually we will vibrate so fast that our physical bodies will literally become immaterial.
We simply phase out of physical reality.
We will become invisible to anyone vibrating at a lower, denser frequency. The book claims humanity will essentially walk directly into a spiritual dimension, creating heaven on earth and bypassing physical death entirely.
It is quite the climax.
I have to push back here. Invisible vibrating bodies. How does an author justify a leap from be nice to your coworkers to we will phase out of physical reality like ghosts?
Your skepticism is entirely warranted, and it is a point where many readers fundamentally diverge from the text. Redfield is introducing a breathtakingly optimistic eschatological vision
Scatological.
relating to the ultimate destiny of humanity. He is attempting to merge the technological utopianism of the late 20th century with the concepts of spiritual ascension found in ancient mystical traditions,
Like what?
such as the ascension of Elijah in the biblical tradition, or the concept of the rainbow body in Tibetan Buddhism.
Oh, I see.
The text is making the ultimate metaphysical claim that our slow biological evolution governed by Darwinian principles was merely the prologue. The next phase is conscious-directed spiritual evolution, where consciousness ultimately masters and transcends physical matter entirely.
That was the end of the original book, and honestly, what a cliffhanger to leave a cultural phenomenon on.
Truly.
But the story didn't stop there. Redfield expanded this massive cosmology with a series of sequels, taking the unnamed narrator far beyond the jungles of Peru. We need to touch on the expanded universe to get the full picture.
The sequels were highly anticipated by a hungry readership and served to systematically flesh out the metaphysical mechanics that the first book only vaguely hinted at.
So, the second book, The 10th Insight, Holding the Vision. Where does that take us?
It shifts the geographical setting from South America to an ancient hidden valley in the Appalachian Mountains.
Back in the States.
Yes. Here, the narrative focus moves away from earthly interpersonal dynamics and delves into the afterlife dimension.
So what happens after we die?
It introduces the concept of soul groups, clusters of souls that supposedly reincarnate together across multiple lifetimes to learn shared karmic lessons.
Like your spiritual cohort.
Exactly. It also heavily features the birth vision.
What is that?
This is the concept that before we are born into a physical body, we survey our upcoming life from a higher dimension. We consciously select our parents, fully knowing the trauma their control dramas will inflict, and we commit to a specific spiritual mission.
That is a wild reframe. So all the deep pain, the trauma, the conflict with your parents. The book argues you actually signed up for it before you were born because it was the exact psychological curriculum your soul required to evolve.
It's a very intense, challenging way to view trauma, yes.
It also talks about holding the vision. Right.
Yes, which is the practice of maintaining a collective, fiercely positive mental image of an awakened humanity to fight off the polarization and fear that constantly threatens to drag society back into the Dark Ages.
Okay, so that's the 10th. Then the series travels across the globe to modern-day Tibet for the third book, The Secret of Shambhala.
Yes, the search for the 11th insight. This installment pivots to deal heavily with the mechanics of what it calls prayer fields.
Prayer fields, how does that work?
It explores the concept that human intention is not merely a passive wish, but a tangible physical force. Our expectations, our hopes, and our affirmative prayers literally project a field of intention out into the physical world that alters probability and reality.
So positive thinking actually shapes the physical world.
It asserts that if we focus our prayer energy with profound gratitude, praying not from a place of lacking, but acting as if the positive outcome has already occurred, we can manifest a peaceful and spiritually attuned future.
It is a profound shift from viewing prayer as a submissive request to a deity to viewing it as an active reality-shaping mechanism.
Empowering the individual, once again.
Which brings us to the final book in the core series, published much later in 2011, The 12th Insight, The Hour of Decision.
This one tackles a very specific cultural moment.
Yeah, the infamous 2012 Mayan prophecy. Remember when pop culture was obsessed with the idea that the Mayan calendar ending meant the world was going to literally explode?
I do, yes. It was quite a panic.
Redfield reframes that entirely. He argues it was never a doomsday prophecy. It was a deadline for a planetary paradigm shift.
The 12th Insight attempts to address the increasing polarization of the modern world.
How does it suggest we fix that?
It focuses on ushering in an era of unprecedented religious tolerance and what Redfield terms conscious conversation. It advocates for humanity to collectively find the middle path between extreme, dogmatic fundamentalist ideologies on one side and cold, rigid secular materialism on the other.
So finding common ground.
The ultimate goal is to seek the essential, unifying messages of love, presence, and divine connection that exist at the esoteric heart of all major world traditions.
Right.
It asks us to bridge the gaps between different faiths by recognizing that the mystic traditions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism are all attempting to describe the exact same underlying universal truth, albeit through different cultural lenses.
So we have this massive, sprawling, multi-dimensional cosmology.
We certainly do.
We have invisible energy fields, childhood psychological vampires, utopian futures where we vibrate into invisibility, soul contracts made before birth, and reality-altering prayer fields.
It is a lot to take in.
As you can imagine, a book making claims this bold and becoming this wildly popular did not go unchallenged.
Not at all.
It faced incredibly heavy, organized criticism from multiple fronts. So what does this all mean? Let's pivot and look at the backlash.
The pushback was indeed substantial, originating from several deeply entrenched institutional and academic quarters.
Let's start with the literary critics.
From a purely literary standpoint, professional critics were merciless. They argued that Redfield's characters were entirely one-dimensional, acting merely as hollow, cardboard mouthpieces to deliver the author's philosophical lectures.
They weren't exactly real people.
No. The plot was viewed as highly contrived, relying on absurd coincidences, which the author, of course, called synchronicities, rather than organic storytelling.
And how did Redfield respond to that?
His defense against this literary assault was always consistent. He stated he never intended to write a masterpiece of realist fiction.
He wrote a parable.
Exactly, a parable. The narrative adventure is simply the accessible vehicle, the spoonful of sugar, designed to help the dense psychological and philosophical medicine go down for a mass audience.
That makes sense. And the scientific community was equally frustrated.
Oh, profoundly.
You have credentialed physicists tearing their hair out over the book's liberal, pseudoscientific misuse of quantum mechanics and relativity.
Yeah.
A physicist will rightly tell you that while subatomic particles exhibit strange behaviors, quantum mechanics absolutely does not prove that the macroscopic universe cares about your career goals or your intentions toward a houseplant.
That is the consensus, yes.
Mm-hmm.
There is no empirical, measurable, peer-reviewed evidence for psychological energy theft or humans vibrating into an invisible dimension.
Plus, historians and archaeologists pointed out the sheer comical absurdity of finding a 600 BC manuscript written in Aramaic buried in Mayan and Incan ruins in Peru. It makes zero historical sense.
The scientific and historical inaccuracies are glaring if one attempts to read the book as a factual, literal document.
Right.
However, the most intense organized friction came from the theological community, particularly from conservative Christian circles.
And to be perfectly clear to our listeners, we are strictly reporting what is in the source material here.
Well,
We aren't taking sides in this theological debate, just laying out the arguments as they happened.
of course. As an impartial observer of the source material in the ensuing cultural debate, it is fascinating to catalog the specific theological objections they raised as it reveals the deep philosophical fault lines the book triggered.
Right. The conservative Christian critiques were fierce and multi-layered. First, they strongly objected to the book's underlying monism and pantheism.
The idea that all is energy and therefore all is a piece of God.
Exactly. Critics argued this fundamental premise erases the vital biblical divide between the sovereign creator and the created universe.
It conflates the two.
Second, they charged the book with extreme self-glorification.
Yes.
The idea that human beings can evolve, raise their own vibration, and literally achieve a state of divinity themselves was seen as a dangerous echoing of the original temptation in the book of Genesis. The serpent promising Eve she would be like God.
Furthermore, theologians critique the book's profound moral relativism. The insights heavily prioritize subjective inner feelings, personal intuitions, and mystical experiences as the ultimate arbiters of truth.
Over scriptural authority.
Yes, elevating individual feelings above objective biblical authority or established church doctrine.
Finally, there was the blatant anti-institutionalism woven into the plot. The book explicitly portrays the church, embodied by the villainous Cardinal Sebastian, as a repressive, unenlightened bureaucracy that actively hides the liberating truth from humanity simply to maintain its own earthly power and control.
A direct attack on their authority.
It's a very heavy list of charges. But regardless of where you stand on the theology or how much you cringe at the misuse of quantum physics, the sheer intensity and volume of these reactions proves one undeniable thing.
What is that?
The Celestine prophecy struck a massive raw nerve in the global consciousness. It resonated with millions upon millions of people who felt unseen by modern society.
That is the enduring truth of the phenomenon. It provided a desperately needed vocabulary for a spiritual yearning that both rigid religious institutions and cold scientific materialism were failing to address.
It gave a generation of people a sense of finally being understood and a framework to process their alienation.
It did.
And looking back from where we sit today, it's incredible how prophetic James Redfield actually was, even if not in the literal sci-fi way he intended. Look at the modern world.
It is quite apparent.
He basically predicted and perhaps helped birth our current $4 trillion global wellness culture. The focus on noticing the signs, trusting your intuition, and staying present. That's the absolute bedrock of every modern mindfulness app on your phone.
Indeed.
The concept of energy fields, positive thinking, and the universe responding to your expectations. That is the exact foundation of the massive manifestation and law of attraction trends dominating social media platforms today.
The lasting power of the Celestine prophecy ultimately does not lie in its historical accuracy, its literary merit, or its scientific validity.
Where does it lie?
Its true power lies in its profound psychological resonance. Redfield offered a deeply accessible, actionable framework for ordinary people to understand their messy interpersonal conflicts.
The control dramas.
It's exactly. The concept of control dramas gave millions of readers the psychological tools to identify toxic behavioral patterns, to finally understand and heal their childhood wounds, and to consciously break generational cycles of family dysfunction.
He gave people permission to look at their ordinary lives and find magic.
Profound meaning and a sense of divine, guided purpose in the mundane coincidences of daily existence.
It really is a modern mythology for self-discovery. We've covered a massive amount of ground today, from the humid Peruvian jungles and the invisible energy fields to the psychological vampires in your office and the wild utopian visions of our future.
A journey in itself.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own time. We've talked a lot today about vibrating so fast that we turn into pure spirit and humanity evolving into a dimension of light.
The eschatological vision.
What if the most radical prophecy in this entire universe isn't about vibrating so high that you become invisible?
What if it isn't?
What if the true, ultimate spiritual leap is simply found in the eighth insight, the radical, incredibly difficult, almost terrifying act of paying total, undivided attention to the beauty of the flawed human being standing right in front of you and expecting absolutely nothing in return?
A profoundly quiet and deeply challenging question to carry forward.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Celestine prophecy. We'll catch you next time.